Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The Amber Father was dying, and everyone in the Velthari Empire had agreed, through generations of careful political consensus, not to talk about it at dinner. This was not denial exactly. The Science Ministry published quarterly reports on the gas giant's luminous decay with the kind of thorough, well-formatted despair that only career bureaucrats can produce, complete with graphs, appendices, and a recurring footnote suggesting that the Empire's quantum siphon arrays were failing faster than anyone had initially projected. That initially projected had itself been revised 4 times, and that the current revised projection was, the footnote carefully implied, probably also optimistic. The reports were read by people who needed to read them. Those people passed them to committees. The committees met, produced their own reports, and the empire continued, which is what empires are fundamentally designed to do, right up until the moment they don't. From the crystallized towers of the palace on Vailth Prime, the Amber Father's light came through in warm, fractured pieces, painting the court in colors that were genuinely beautiful. The kind of beautiful that makes a person feel something complicated if they think too long about its source. Most people at court had developed, over years of practice, the ability to enjoy the light without examining it. This is one of the quietly essential skills of anyone who lives close to power. It was into this atmosphere of productive avoidance that the diplomatic courier from the Keth Continuum arrived on a morning that had already committed to being unremarkable. The vessel docked at the primary orbital port with the quiet efficiency of a ship built by people who believed in doing things correctly on the first attempt, which immediately distinguished it from most Velthari infrastructure. 12 officials stood in the receiving bay in their formal ministerial coats. They had been briefed. They were prepared. They held their composure in both hands the way a person holds a full cup of something hot. Sarah Voss stepped through the docking corridor and into the amber light of Vailth Prime, and the 12 officials maintained approximately 4 seconds of professionalism before the remaining 8 seconds found other things to do. She was not what they had expected, though none of them would have been able to explain precisely what they had expected instead. She stood with the particular stillness of someone who has no need to perform composure because composure is simply her default operating state, the way certain mathematical constants simply are what they are without requiring justification. Her face held a symmetry that produced in the observer a faint, irrational suspicion that faces were not typically permitted to behave that way. Along the lines of her jaw and across her collarbones, there ran a faint luminescent tracery, not a glow exactly, more like light's handwriting, pressed just beneath the surface of her skin as if something radiant had learned, through long and deliberate practice, to be discreet. Her eyes were the color of the Amber Father's light filtered through very deep water, layered, gold at the center, bleeding outward into a green that darkened toward the edges into something almost oceanic. She had 4 fingers on each hand, each slightly longer than expectation suggested, moving when they moved with the articulate precision of someone who had been told, at some point in her life, that her gestures were distracting, and who had considered this feedback thoroughly and elected to do nothing about it. She looked at the 12 officials standing in their formal coats and offered them a smile of genuine, unhurried warmth. Then she said, in Velthari standards so clean it made the language sound as though it had been recently edited for clarity, that she was very pleased to be here, that she was greatly looking forward to the collaborative work ahead, and also that she had noted on the approach vector that the primary quantum siphon array positioned above the 3rd, equatorial band was operating at approximately 62% of its rated efficiency, and that she had 3 ideas about that if anyone wished to hear them now, or she could easily save them for the introductory technical meeting if the current moment felt premature. She was entirely flexible on the timing. The Royal Science Advisor, Orvith Callan, had spent 40 years being the most informed person in most rooms. He had written a welcoming speech. The speech addressed the Empire's distinguished scientific heritage, the long tradition of interstellar research cooperation, and a paragraph about cross-civilizational knowledge exchange that he was, privately, quite proud of. He had practiced the speech twice that morning and considered it one of his better ones. He folded it in half, put it in his coat pocket, said nothing. It would remain there undelivered for the remainder of his career. The first thing the Science Ministry learned about Sarah Voss was that she was right. The second thing they learned was that she was going to keep being right, consistently and without apparent effort, and that this was going to require a significant institutional adjustment in how the ministry understood the word verification. Her first 3 months on Veilth Prime were spent in the kind of bureaucratic waiting that the Empire had refined over centuries into something approaching an art form. Access requests moved through committees. Committees consulted subcommittees. Subcommittees drafted position papers on the theoretical frameworks governing access requests, which were then submitted to the original committees for review. Sarah attended every meeting she was invited to, arrived exactly on time, and brought her own calculations, which she would work through quietly on a handheld lattice pad while the committees discussed the procedural architecture of the meeting they were currently in. She was given, eventually, provisional research access to a secondary facility on Veilth Tertius. The decision was communicated to her by a junior ministry clerk, who delivered it with the carefully calibrated tone of someone conferring a significant gift, and who noticed, only after finishing his prepared remarks, that she had already submitted a list of equipment she would need for the Veilth Tertius facility, dated 3 weeks prior, to a different department, and that the equipment had already arrived. Her microstabilization technique for degrading siphon arrays was tested at Veilth Tertius, because Veilth Tertius was the moon the Empire had collectively decided it could most reasonably sacrifice in the event of a catastrophic research failure. This had never been stated in any official document. It was simply the kind of organizational understanding that forms naturally when 7 moons of unequal strategic importance are administered by the same government. Sarah did not comment on this. She went to Veilth Tertius, set up her equipment, and ran her technique on the primary siphon array over the course of 11 days, while the ministry's monitoring team watched from a safe distance with the expressions of people who very much wanted this to succeed, and had prepared themselves, psychologically, for it not to. On the 12th day, the array's output increased by 31% and held there, steady and warm, without the oscillation patterns that had been logged as a permanent feature of aging siphon infrastructure for so long that the junior technicians had simply been trained to treat them as normal. The monitoring team filed their report. The Science Council issued a statement of congratulation. Orvith Callan read it aloud in plenary session and stopped twice, in the middle of sentences, for reasons his staff interpreted differently depending on their seniority. Sarah received the congratulations and returned to work. The years that followed had a particular rhythm to them. She would identify a problem, propose a solution, encounter a committee, wait, be proven right, receive acknowledgement, and return to the next problem. The cycle repeated with such regularity that the Science Ministry's administrative calendar developed a category for it that the clerks unofficially labeled, in their internal scheduling system, as another Voss situation. This label was not unkind. It was practical. When an item was marked as a Voss situation, the relevant staff knew to prepare the congratulatory documentation in advance and simply leave the date blank. In her 7th year, she was brought before the Emperor's court to present the resonance lattice framework. The session was scheduled for 2 hours. It ran for 6, because every time the Science Council thought they had reached the boundary of the framework's implications, Sarah would address a question from the floor, and the answer would open a new perimeter that required further examination. Orvith Callan, who had attended enough imperial presentations to know that 6-hour sessions ended either in triumph or in someone being escorted from the building, developed a headache around hour 4 that he would later describe as the most productive headache of my professional life. It was in the antechamber afterward, in the loose gathering of officials and researchers that follows any long session where things have gone significantly better than expected, that Sarah first spoke with Crown Prince Aldavith. He was younger then than the Empire's problems made him feel, and he carried the particular self-awareness of someone who has grown up surrounded by experts and made his peace with not being one. He found her near the window that overlooked the palace's lower crystalline spires, where the Amber Father's light was coming through at the late-day angle that made everything look, briefly, like it was worth saving. He asked her, with the directness that his advisors periodically encouraged him to moderate, whether she actually believed her framework could fix the Empire's energy situation. Not improve it, fix it. Sarah looked at him steadily and said that she could build something that would make the Empire more stable than it had ever been in its recorded history, and that it would require replacing certain foundational infrastructure rather than repairing it, because there were systems old enough that repair was a way of postponing a conversation that would need to happen regardless, and she preferred to have necessary conversations sooner than later. Aldavith said that sounded like a yes. She said it was, in fact, a yes. He nodded slowly, looking out at the dying light of the Amber Father, and did not say what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was that she was the first person to give him a yes without qualifications in longer than he could clearly remember. He filed this feeling away in the category where he kept things he would need to think about later, when there was time, not knowing that later and time were both, in their own ways, already spoken for. The Empire stopped noticing it was dependent the same way a person stops noticing the hum of a ventilation system, not because the sound disappears, but because the mind, in its infinite capacity for adaptation, reclassifies the constant as silence. By the time Sarah Voss had been on Veilth Prime for 11 years, the resonance lattice was not a new technology anymore. It was simply how things worked. And things working, after 2 generations of things working poorly, had produced in the Velthari Empire a kind of collective exhale so long and so deep that it had quietly restructured public life around the assumption of its continuation. The lights held. This sounds like a small thing until you have lived in an empire where they didn't. The Science Ministry's internal efficiency reports, which had spent decades serving as a formal record of incremental institutional failure, had turned, in the past 4 years, into something that required a new category of language. The word unprecedented appeared so frequently in the quarterly summaries that the ministry's chief editor quietly flagged it in a style memorandum and suggested the staff diversify their vocabulary. The staff understood the note but found, each quarter, that the alternatives felt like understatements, and the word crept back in regardless, like a weed with excellent credentials. Sarah had moved, by the 11th year, from the provisional research quarters she had been assigned on arrival, which she had never complained about, though she had once noted, entirely without inflection, that the signal geometry of the building was suboptimal for sensitive entanglement work, into a purpose-built research division in the Science Ministry's central complex on Veilth Prime. The division bore no name on the official registry except its administrative code. Her staff called it, with the habitual irreverence of people who work very hard and feel they have earned small freedoms, the Lattice House. She did not discourage this. She did not encourage it either. She simply continued working, which was, for Sarah Voss, the same as most forms of communication. The integrated lattice framework rollout had been Emperor Aldavith's first major sovereign initiative. He had announced it in his inaugural address with the careful confidence of a man who had chosen to put his credibility behind something because the alternative, continuing to manage decline with inherited tools, was a kind of slow defeat he found philosophically unacceptable. His advisors had recommended a phased implementation. Sarah had recommended a phased implementation. The Imperial Infrastructure Council had recommended a phased implementation. Everyone had recommended a phased implementation, and that is in fact what happened, which is almost never the case when everyone agrees. So the historians would later note it as an unusual moment of institutional coherence. The defense network was integrated first, because the military command was the constituency most resistant to change, and therefore the most satisfying, politically, to convert. Admiral Tovin Rask, who had spent 30 years maintaining the defense grid through a combination of experienced intuition and aggressive underreporting of its actual failure rate, was presented with an efficiency projection for the lattice integrated system that he publicly called ambitious and privately called, in a message to his second-in-command that would later become mildly famous within defense ministry circles. The kind of numbers that make you wonder whether someone is selling you something, except she isn't actually selling anything, which somehow makes it worse. The lattice integration of the defense network was completed in 8 months. The grid performed at the projected efficiency. Admiral Rask submitted his formal endorsement to the Imperial Infrastructure Council in a document that was thorough, professional, and contained, in its concluding paragraph, a sentence so syntactically compressed that the ministry's chief linguist was called in to confirm it was, in fact, praise. It was. The admiral was simply constitutionally incapable of making praise look comfortable. Agricultural processing across the 7 moons followed, then the civic power distribution networks, then the orbital transit coordination systems, whose previous management had involved a scheduling protocol so ancient that 2 of the senior coordinators had, over the years, formed a kind of protective fondness for its inefficiencies. The way one becomes fond of a difficult relative who has been present at every significant occasion. The transition took 14 months, the coordinators adapted, the protocol was retired. No one scheduled a memorial service for it, though one of the senior coordinators did, reportedly, have a quiet moment alone in the archive room where its original documentation was stored, which is the sort of thing that happens when institutions change, and is a sign, generally, of a healthy relationship with institutional memory. What no one in the ministry had fully mapped, because the thing itself had been assembled across 11 years in logical increments, each of which was individually unremarkable, was the complete picture. When the Imperial Facilities Directorate commissioned a structural overview of the Empire's integrated infrastructure in the 13th year, a routine assessment, the kind that generates a report that gets filed and referenced and occasionally consulted, the analyst assigned to it spent 4 days producing the standard documentation, and then 1 additional day sitting with the complete diagram, during which time she sent 3 messages to her supervisor that escalated in tone from, "I want to flag something," to, "I think we should talk about this," to, "Are you available now?" Her supervisor reviewed the diagram. The diagram showed clearly that every critical system in the Velthari Empire, power generation, defense, agriculture, transit, was now integrated through the quantum entanglement matrix architecture at its core. The architecture was accessible for operational purposes. Its foundational calibration, however, rooted through verification protocols maintained exclusively by Sarah's research division, on the documented grounds that external calibration access created a security vulnerability against foreign interference. The Security Council had approved this. The approval was on file. It was dated 3 years ago and signed by 7 people who had been, at the time of signing, very grateful for the security justification. The supervisor filed the analyst's concern as a technical note in the appendix of the structural overview. The overview was submitted to the Imperial Infrastructure Council. The Infrastructure Council logged it as received. Life in the Empire continued, warmly lit, stable, efficiently managed, functioning better than it ever had. On the night the overview was filed, in the Lattice House on Vailth Prime, Sarah stood before the holographic network display her division used for system-wide monitoring. Every moon glowed in the projection, connected by the entanglement lines she had spent 13 years threading through the Empire's foundations. She reached out one hand and traced the lines from node to node, unhurried, the way a person reads a page they have memorized, not for information, but for the confirmation that the words are still where they left them. They were. The morning of the synchronization was, by every available metric, ordinary. Emperor Aldavith II reviewed 3 infrastructure reports over breakfast, all of which were positive, which had become so standard a feature of his mornings that he had begun, privately, to miss the texture of a problem. Not a large problem, just something with enough friction to remind him that governing was a dynamic activity rather than a ceremonial relationship with excellent paperwork. He signed 2 trade agreements, listened to his communication staff outline the day's schedule, and was informed, in the same breath as a note about an afternoon reception for the Moon Vale Sextus's agricultural delegation, that the Integrated Lattice Framework's quarterly synchronization was proceeding at midday as scheduled. He nodded. He had stopped attending the quarterly synchronizations after the third one, because the third one had been, by the unambiguous consensus of everyone present, the least eventful 90 minutes in the history of events. His science advisor had described it, in the post-session summary, as a confirmation that the system continues to function as designed, which was the administrative equivalent of reporting that the sky remained in its previously agreed-upon position. At midday, the synchronization began. What happened in the following 11 seconds was, from a technical standpoint, extraordinary. From an observational standpoint, it was completely invisible. Every power generation facility in the Empire received a calibration update that rerouted its core operational authorization through an external verification node. The defense network's access hierarchy shifted 2 levels, cleanly, in a process logged by the automated monitoring systems as a routine protocol refresh and flagged for nothing. The agricultural coordination systems on all 7 moons received a new administrative tier silently, between 2 scheduled processing cycles, in the gap so brief that the systems themselves did not register an interruption. The Transit Coordination Network updated its authorization framework and continued scheduling orbital departures without a pause. The Empire kept functioning. The lights stayed on. The harvests continued. The defense grid reported nominal efficiency. Somewhere on Valeth Tertius, the siphon array that had started all of this continued producing 31% above its original rating, faithfully, as it had for 15 years, because Sarah Voss had built things to last regardless of who was operating them. And this was, in its way, the most complete expression of her character. For 6 hours, the Velthari Empire ran perfectly and had no idea that it was running under new management. Then Sarah Voss requested an emergency audience with the Emperor. She arrived at the Imperial Presence Chamber without the Scientific Ministry's usual escort, which was the first thing the Imperial Guard noted. The second thing they noted was that she was wearing something different, a formal coat they had not seen before, dark as deep space, with threadwork at the collar that seemed, in certain angles of light, to move. The bioluminescent tracery along her jaw was fully visible now, no longer subtle, illuminating her face from within with the steady patience of something that had simply been waiting for permission to be seen. She walked at the same pace she always walked, which had the disorienting effect of making the guard's formal escort procedure look less like security and more like accompaniment. Aldavith had assembled his full council in the chamber, because the words emergency audience combined with Sarah Voss had produced, in his chief of staff, an instinct too strong to ignore. Orvith Callan was present, retired 3 years now, retrieved for this occasion because the current science advisor had heard the same 2 words and gone briefly, the color of unprocessed lattice crystal. Callan had arrived without being told why, and had sat down in his old chair at the council table with the air of a man who has been expecting a particular conversation for some time and has made his peace with it. Sarah stood before the emperor and she told him everything. She told him about the quantum entanglement matrices embedded in the core architecture of every critical system. She told him about the authorization transfer that had occurred at midday, so smooth and complete that his own monitoring infrastructure had cataloged it as maintenance. She told him that the Empire's power grid, its defense network, its agricultural systems, and its transit coordination were now, in the only sense that practically mattered, operating under her authority rather than the Crown's, and that this had been true in its foundational design, since the day she submitted the original resonance lattice proposal, which the Science Council had approved in a 6-hour session, which Orvith Callan had attended with a headache, which he was now experiencing again in a significantly more informed context. Callan made a face. It was the face, the one his staff had catalogued across decades of watching Sarah be right about things. It was doing new and more complex work now than it had ever been asked to do before, and it was managing. One council member, a man named Porvith who oversaw infrastructure administration, and who would later describe this moment in his published memoirs as the afternoon I learned that understanding a process is not the same as understanding what the process is for, asked whether this meant the quarterly synchronizations had never been routine. Sarah said that they had always been exactly this. Porvith sat back in his chair and looked at the empty space in front of him, where the last 4 years of quarterly synchronization reports had, somewhere in his memory, just rearranged themselves into a completely different document. Aldavith had not spoken since she began. He sat at the head of the council table and listened to everything, and the council watched him listen, and the chamber was very quiet except for Sarah's voice, which was the same voice it had always been, precise, unhurried, without performance. Only now the thing it was describing was no longer a solution to someone else's problem. When she finished, Aldavith asked her what she wanted, because he was, after 15 years, someone who understood how she worked. She did not do things without destinations. Every structure she built served a purpose larger than the structure itself, and the purpose was always declared, eventually, in the same clear and unequivocal language she used for everything else. Sarah told him about the Keth continuum. She told him that it was dying, not slowly, not manageably, but in the rapid and irreversible way of civilizations that had reached the end of what their particular piece of the universe was willing to sustain. She told him she had left it 15 years ago, carrying an assignment that her government had known, even as they gave it to her, was the longest possible play available to a civilization with limited time and no leverage. To go somewhere stable, to become indispensable, and to return, eventually, with terms that a sovereign empire would actually accept, because no civilization in the history of interstellar relations had ever willingly absorbed a refugee population without something shifting the negotiation away from charity. She had shifted it. She told him she did not want to rule the Velthari Empire. She told him she wanted to merge what remained of the Keth continuum, its people, its knowledge, the complete genetic and cultural archives of a civilization that had run out of world but not out of ingenuity, into the empire, under terms structured to ensure the merger was a partnership rather than an absorption, and that those terms required her to arrive at the table holding something the empire could not simply refuse. So she had built herself something to hold. The chamber stayed quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that the light from the Amber Father moved slightly across the floor, which it did in the afternoons, tracing the slow geometry of a dying star's remaining schedule. Aldavith looked at Sarah across the council table and thought about the evening, 15 years ago, when she had told him she could make the empire more stable than it had ever been in its recorded history. He had filed the feeling away that evening in the category of things to think about later. He had never quite gotten to it, and now here was later, arrived in full, sitting across from him in a coat with living threadwork, entirely willing to wait. He told her he would need his council's deliberation. She said, of course. She said she would be in her laboratory when he was ready. She said, and here something in her expression shifted, just slightly, in the way that glaciers shift, which is to say in a way that is small and represents a very large movement of something deep. That she was sorry for the method, if not the necessity, and that she understood if the distinction provided him no immediate comfort. Then she stood and inclined her head in the formal Vilthari gesture of respect that she had learned in her first month on Vailth Prime and never once omitted, and walked out of the Imperial Presence Chamber at exactly the same pace she had walked in. Callan watched her go. Then he looked at the Emperor. Then he took the welcoming speech out of his coat pocket, not the same coat, not the same pocket, but he had taken to carrying it as a kind of professional talisman in the years since the day he folded it, and set it on the table in front of him. He smoothed it flat. 15 years of folding had left it soft as cloth. He thought about a woman stepping off a courier vessel into amber light, saying she had 3 ideas about the siphon array on the approach vector. He thought, not for the first time, that he should have given the speech anyway. It had been a good paragraph about knowledge exchange. Outside the palace on all 7 moons, the lights held steady, warm and unwavering, burning with a consistency that the Empire had never managed on its own, which was, Sarah had always known, the most honest thing she ever built for them, and the one they would